Welcome everybody to our ComAI lecture today, the third one. You can see there the list of the others. So next presentation after the Christmas break will be by Arne Hinz from Cardiff University, with the institution which we have an alliance. He will speak about AI governance, but today we have a completely different kind of topic with David Gunkel, a colleague from Northern Illinois University, a professor for communications there. We had already some conversations yesterday about, well, the amazing career David Gunkel has. I didn't know that you studied philosophy before, but it makes a lot of sense now, knowing it, especially highlighting some of the publications. So the first book I came across, which was published by David, was about Heidegger and the media. I checked it. It's still in my shelf. But I think the more interesting piece I read from the earlier writings was an article I came across later. It was already 2012 about a topic of our ComAI lectures. It was an article about communication and artificial intelligence. So you realize that David is really a big expert on a topic which now became a fashion. But I would say you were one of them who made it part of media and communications. Other important publications by him are a book about robot rights, which I also love. So it's a kind of philosophical approach, thinking about different kinds of possibility, how we might imagine that robots might get it right. And then I think the book most of you know, an introduction to communication and artificial intelligence. David is on a tour, this is how you call it, for the latest book with the title Person, Think, Robot, which is out at MIT Press. And this is the background of David Gunkel's talk today. Welcome to Bremen.
Thank you. So my thanks especially to Andres for arranging all this and putting it all in place so I could be with you here this evening, and then also for you showing up on a rather snowy evening and coming out to hear me talk about AI and some moral, legal, and related issues. So I'm going to talk about items from the book. The book was just published in September. The good news is it's open access, and I have a QR code at the end, and you just download your own copy. You don't have to get out your credit card. It's entirely free, and so you can get it for yourself if you're in any way interested in what I talk about. Obviously, I will not talk about everything in the book. We'd be here far too long. But what I want to do is put a few ideas out for us to think about and use that as a way of leveraging a conversation, a discussion about this material. And that should take me about 30 minutes at most. And then the balance will be for us to have, I hope, a robust question and answer period. All right, so let's just delve right into it. I call it the relational turn, a techno-ethics for the 21st century and beyond. So, ethics is an exclusive undertaking in confronting and dealing with others, whether it be another human person, a non-human animal, or even an artifact. We make a decision between who is worthy of consideration and respect and what remains a mere thing that can be used and maybe even abused as we decide and see fit. Now, the question matters because it divides the world of other entities into other persons who count versus mere things that do not. Further complicating matters is the fact that the distinction is neither fixed nor stable. The boundary separating who is a person from what is a thing has been flexible, dynamic, and alterable. Now, this is actually a good thing because ethics and law both innovate and advance by critically questioning their own limitations and accommodating many previously excluded or marginalized others, recognizing as persons what had previously been considered merely a thing. So the question I think that now confronts us at the beginning of the 21st century is what I would call the machine question. That is, can we or should we recognize AI, robots, and other seemingly social and intelligent artifacts as another significant entity with some claim on us? Or are they nothing more than a mere thing, an instrument, a tool, or a piece of property? Now, the responses to this question tend to pull in two very different directions. On the one side, those opposing any form of social status for artifacts assert that these technologies are mere things or objects that do not possess and will not come to possess the necessary conditions or capabilities to ever be considered something more. On the other side, there are those who favor extending some aspect of social status to AI and robots by arguing that these technological things either have or will soon be able to possess one or more of the necessary and essential properties to be considered something more than a mere thing. Now, what is interesting in this debate is not what makes the one side different from the other side. What's interesting is what both sides already share and hold in common in order to have this conversation and debate in the first place. And the real problem isn't that this shared philosophical scaffolding has somehow failed to work in the face of AI and robots. It's that it works too well, often exerting its influence without us recognizing why or how, or even questioning where it comes from and what its assumptions are. So here's my plan. I want to respond to this problem, and I want to do so by moving in 4 discrete steps. I want to begin by addressing what we normally do when we try to resolve these questions, and I call this the properties approach. This is the way we typically decide questions of who is a person and what is a thing. And then in response to demonstrated difficulties that we'll look at with the properties approach, I want to introduce and describe an alternative model that shifts emphasis from the internal properties of an individual entity to the extrinsic social circumstances and relationships in which it finds itself. Thirdly, then, I want to consider some possible objections to this relational turn in moral thinking and provide some responses to these criticisms. And then finally, I want to conclude by explaining how the goal in all of this is not to complicate things, but to introduce and formulate a meta-ethical theory that is more agile in its response to the unique opportunities and the challenges that confront us right now at the beginning of the 21st century. So let's start then with the properties approach. In responding to others and doing so responsibly, we typically need to distinguish between what is a thing and who is a person. As Roberto Esposito, who arguably wrote the book on this matter, explains, if there's one assumption that seems to have organized human experience from its very beginnings, it is that of a division between persons and things. No other principle is so deeply rooted in our perception and in our moral conscience. Now again, what's important here is not this difference per se, but how this differentiation comes to be decided and justified. In order for something to have anything like moral or legal status, it would need to be recognized as another person and not a mere thing. Now, the standard approaches to addressing and resolving these matters typically proceed by following a rather simple decision-making process, or what we could even call a moral decision algorithm. In this transaction, we first make a determination as to what property or set of properties are necessary and sufficient for something to have a particular claim to moral recognition and respect. We then investigate whether an entity actually possesses that property or not. And then finally, by applying the criteria decided in step 1 to the entity identified in step 2, it becomes possible to determine whether the entity in question either can have a claim to moral status or whether it is to be regarded as a mere thing. Now, this way of proceeding sounds intuitively correct and rather natural. On this account, questions concerning moral and legal status are firmly anchored in and justified by the essential nature or the being of the entity that is determined to possess them. In this transaction, what something is determines how it is treated. Or to put it in more formalistic philosophical language, ontology precedes and determines social, moral, and even legal status. But there are 3 problems with this approach. Problems with determination, definition, and detection. And what I want to do is just talk briefly about what these 3 problems are and why it complicates the way we normally make these decisions. So first of all, determination. How does one determine which exact property or set of properties are the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be a moral subject? In other words, which one or ones count? The history of moral philosophy can in fact be read as something of an ongoing debate and a struggle over this very matter, with different properties vying for attention at different times. And in this process, many properties that at one time seemed both necessary and sufficient have turned out to be spurious, prejudicial, or both. Second, definition. Irrespective of which property or set of properties is selected, they each have problems with definition. Take, for example, the property of consciousness, which is often utilized in discussions and debates regarding the moral or legal status for intelligent machines and artifacts. Unfortunately, there is no universally accepted or widely distributed definition of this term. The problem, as Max Velmans points out, is that the term means many different things to many different people, and no universally agreed core meaning exists. In fact, if there's any general agreement among philosophers, psychologists, cognitive scientists, neurobiologists, AI researchers, and robotics engineers regarding the property of consciousness, it is that there is little or no agreed upon definition when it comes to deciding the word consciousness. Lastly, there are epistemological difficulties with detection. Most of the properties that are considered morally relevant, like consciousness, sentience, or the experience of pain, are internal mental states or capabilities that are not immediately accessible or directly observable. This epistemological barrier is something philosophers commonly call the problem of other minds. And here's how Paul Churchland describes it. How does one determine whether something other than oneself, an alien creature, a sophisticated robot, or a socially active computer, or even another human, is really a thinking, feeling, conscious being, rather than, for example, an unconscious automaton whose behavior arises from something other than genuine mental states? If you know your history of European philosophers, this is Descartes' problem in the Meditations, right? Cogito ergo sum, he knows he thinks, he looks out the window, he can't be sure other things think. And he's not sure if the other people he sees outside are really other people who think like him, or if they're just automatons going through their paces like robots. So, philosophers, psychologists, cognitive scientists, and neuroscientists have thrown an impressive amount of argumentative and experimental effort at resolving this problem, but so far it hasn't been resolvable in any way approaching what we would call definitive evidence. In other words, no matter what property is identified, it is always possible to see reasonable doubt concerning its actual presence in another. Even if the problem of other minds is not the intractable philosophical dilemma that is often advertised, it is sufficient for sowing doubt about the presence or the absence of the qualifying property, and by extension rendering decisions about moral and legal status tentative, indeterminate, and uncertain. Now, perhaps the best example with the properties approach and its problems can be seen with the recent events surrounding former Google engineer Blake Lemoine and the large language model, which was introduced by Google not too long ago. In June of 2022, Lemoine claimed that the Lambda system was conscious, and therefore it was a person deserving of moral respect and consideration. Google obviously shot back, not only arguing that Lambda, like any computer application, was not conscious and therefore not a person, but suspending and eventually firing Lemoine. Now, both sides in this debate asserted and sought to justify their positions by mobilizing the properties approach, and each side struggled with the problems of determination, definition, and detection. In fact, the entire debate circulated around an inability to resolve these fundamental questions. Lemoine said it's conscious, Google said it isn't. Lemoine says it's a person, Google said it isn't. And the only way it was resolved is by Google firing Lemoine. But they never resolved the terms of the debate itself, right? They just dismissed Lemoine as an employee of Google. All right. So, in response to these problems, many philosophers, especially in the continental and feminist STS traditions, have advanced methods of resolving the question of moral and legal status that can be characterized as a relational turn in thinking about these kinds of questions. And this alternative has really three pivotal characteristics, and I want to just talk about each one of these very briefly. First, moral status is decided and conferred not on the basis of subjective or internal properties that are determined in advance, but according to objectively observable extrinsic social relationships. As we encounter and interact with others, whether they be another human person, a non-human animal, or even a seemingly intelligent machine, it is first and foremost experienced in a relationship to us. Consequently, the question of moral or even legal status doesn't depend on what the other is in its essence, but on how it stands in relationship to us, and how we decide to respond and then take responsibility for our mode of responding. In this transaction, relations are prior to the things related, or as Karen Berard has argued, the relationship comes first in both temporal status and sequence. It takes precedence over the individual relata. Now, this change in perspective is not just a theoretical proposal. It has been experimentally confirmed in numerous social scientific investigations in the field of communication. The computer R social actor studies, the CASA studies, undertaken by Byron Reeves and Clifford Noss, for example, demonstrate that human users will accord computers and other technological artifacts social standing, similar to that of another human person, and that this occurs as a product of the extrinsic social interaction, irrespective of the intrinsic properties, actually known or not, of the individual entities that are involved in that interaction. Social standing, in other words, and in their words in particular, is a mindless operation, and it's mindless in two senses. First, it doesn't require a resolution of the problem of other minds, and it is something we do automatically, almost without thinking. And these results have been verified in numerous robot abuse studies, which have taken place in the last decade or so, where human-robot interaction researchers have found that human subjects respond emotionally to robots and express empathic concern for the machine, irrespective of the cognitive properties or inner workings of the device. If you don't know this research, it's really fascinating stuff. What the researchers do is they bring a lot of human subjects into the lab, they give them a robot, and they give them hammers, and they say, have at it. And they encourage them to harm the robot. And it turns out human beings are really reticent to do so. And even when they know it's just a robot, even when they're told it doesn't feel anything, it's just a piece of plastic, you can harm it, you can hurt it, it won't attack you, it won't kill you, it won't feel anything, people are still reticent to do so. In other studies, they've had human subjects watch videos of animal abuse and then videos of robot abuse. And then they'll use an fMRI machine to detect the brain patterns. The brain patterns when human subjects watch animal abuse is no different from when they watch robot abuse. It's the same cognitive experience for a lot of people. And so this has been going on for a decade. And if you're looking for literature in this area, look to either Chris Bartnick or Astrid Rosenthal van der Putten, which is, she's over in Aachen. They've all done some really amazing work in this field, but it's pretty intriguing HRI kind of research. All right, so second, phenomenological. This alternative that I'm presenting is phenomenological, or if you prefer, radically empirical in its epistemological commitments. Because moral status in this case is dependent upon extrinsic social circumstances and not internal properties. The seemingly irreducible problem of other minds is not some fundamental epistemological barrier that has to be resolved in advance of any decision-making. Instead of being derailed by the epistemological problem of other minds and the complications that it brings, the relational turn immediately affirms and acknowledges this difficulty as the basic condition of possibility for anything we call ethics as such. Consequently, the ethical relationship, as the Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas writes, is not grafted onto an antecedent relationship of cognition. It is a foundation and not a superstructure. It is then more cognitive than cognition itself, and all objectivity must participate in it. Ethics, then, not only transpires prior to and in advance of resolving the epistemological questions, it provides the foundation for addressing and responding to these questions in their first place. All of this then to say that the order of precedence in moral decision-making should probably be reversed. Internal properties do not come first, and then moral respect follows from that ontological fact. We actually have things backwards. We project the morally relevant properties onto or into those others who we have already decided to treat as being socially and morally significant. In social situations, then, we always and already decide between who counts as a morally significant other and what does not, and then retroactively justify these actions by finding the essential properties that we believe motivated this decision-making in the first place. Properties, therefore, are not the intrinsic prior conditions of moral status. They are the products of extrinsic social interactions with and in the face of others. Third and finally, making moral status dependent on consciousness or some other psychological capability belonging to the individual is a thoroughly Cartesian way of proceeding. Other cultures distributed across time and space do not divide up and make sense of the diversity of being in this arguably binary fashion. They perform decisive cuts separating the who from the what, according to other ways of seeing, valuing, and acting. And we can identify alternative ways of organizing social responsibilities and relationships by considering cosmologies that are not part of the Western philosophical lineage. And I want to look at this quote here from Archer Petuas, who writes, this is a collaboratively written essay by 5 indigenous scholars working in AI. And they came together to write a sort of indigenous perspective on artificial intelligence. And so Petuas is from the Plains Cree people. The Plains Cree people are a indigenous group of people living in the central part of North America, part of Canada down through the central United States. So he writes this: the Plains Cree language divides everything into 2 primary categories, animate and inanimate. One is not better than the other. They are merely different states of being. These categories are flexible. Certain toys are inanimate until a child is playing with them, during which time they are animate. A record player is considered animate, while a record, radio, or television set is inanimate. But animate or inanimate, all things have a place in our circle of kinship. Now, this alternative runs counter to the dominant ways of thinking, seeing the boundary between what Western ontologies call person and thing as being endlessly flexible, permeable, and more of a continuum than an oppositional binary. Similar opportunities or challenges are available by way of other non-Western religious and philosophical traditions. In her investigation of the social position of robots in Japan, for instance, Jennifer Robinson finds a remarkably different way to organize differences between living persons and artificially designed or manufactured things. And she writes this: Anochi, the Japanese word for life, encompasses 3 basic, seemingly contradictory but interarticulated meanings. A power that infuses sentient being from generation to generation, a period between birth and death, and, most relevant to robots, the most essential quality of something, whether organic or manufactured. Thus, robots are experienced as living things. The most important point to remember here is that there is no ontological pressure to make distinctions between organic, inorganic, animate, inanimate, human, non-human forms. On the contrary, all these forms are linked to form a continuous network of being. Now, these are not the only available alternatives, and by citing these 2 instances, my intention is not to suggest that these different ways of thinking differently are somehow better than those developed in Western philosophical and religious traditions. These alternatives are just different, and in being different, offer us the opportunity for critically questioning what is often assumed to be true and goes by without saying. Gesturing in the direction of other ways of thinking and being can have the effect of shaking one's often unquestioned confidence in cultural constructs that are already not natural, universal, or eternally true. All right, so the relational turn introduces an alternative that supplies other ways of responding to and taking responsibility for others and other forms of otherness. But is by no means a panacea, nor is it a kind of moral theory of everything. It just arranges for other kinds of questions and modes of inquiry that are seemingly more attentive to the exigencies of life as it appears and is encountered here and now at the beginning of the 21st century. Now, having said that, it's important to recognize that this relational ethics is not without its own set of challenges, and I will look at 2 possible criticisms in particular. So first, relativism. For all its opportunities for thinking otherwise, the relational turn risks exposure to the charge of moral relativism. And there have been a number of recent publications that develop this line of criticism, like this one from Kensuke Musakis, from the book Smart Technologies and Fundamental Rights. And Musakis writes the following: As Simon Kirchen explains, the key relativistic thought is that the something that acts as a standard will be different for different people, and that all such standards are equally authoritative. Particularly problematic is the extreme version, which denies there being any moral judgments or standards that could be objectively true or false. Given the apparent rejection of any such standard by Kuckelberg and Gunkel, they seem hard-pressed to explain how the radically relational ethics they are advocating avoids the extreme version. So, the perceived problem with relativism, especially the extreme version of relativism that Moussakas talks about here, is that it encourages and supports a situation where it seems anything goes and all things are permitted. But this particular understanding of relative is itself limited and the product of a culturally specific understanding of and expectation for ethics. Robert Scott, for instance, understands relativism in an entirely different way. He sees relativism as a positive and not a negative. And here's how Scott describes this difference. Relativism supposedly means a standardless society, or at least a maze of differing standards and thus a cacophony of disparate and likely selfish interests. Rather than a standardless society, which is the same as saying there's no society at all, relativism indicates circumstances in which standards have to be established cooperatively and renewed repeatedly. This means that one can remain critical of moral relativism in the usual dogmatic sense of the phrase, while being open and receptive to the fact that many moral standards, like our social conventions and our legal statutes, are socially constructed formations that are subjected to and the subject of difference. Charles Scott, for his case, calls this alternative ethical pluralism, and he describes ethical pluralism like this. Pluralism stands as a third possibility, one that is something of a middle ground between absolutism and relativism. Ethical pluralism requires us to think in a both-and sort of way, as it conjoins both shared norms and their diverse interpretations and applications in different cultures, times, and places. And the feminist Rosie Braidotti calls upon and mobilizes a version of non-Western perspectivism, which she argues can exceed the grasp of Western epistemologies. Perspectivism, as the anthropologist from Brazil, Eduardo Viveiro de Castro, explains, in his work with the Amerindian traditions, is not relativism. That is the affirmation of the relativity of truth, but relationalism, through which one can affirm the truth of the relative is the relation. I recognize it's a bit hard to get your head around, so let me just break it down a bit here. So what Braidotti sees here and what she wants to work with is the fact that this perspectivism is not just different from, but she argues is the antidote to relativism. This methodology, as she explains, differing viewpoints from equally material, embedded, and embodied locations that express the degree of power and quality of experience of different subjects. Braidotti therefore recognizes that what is called truth is always formulated and operationalized from a particular subject position, which is dynamic, different, and diverse. The task is not to escape from these differences in order to occupy some fantastic transcendental vantage point, but to learn to take responsibility for these inescapable alterations in perspective and their diverse social, moral, and material consequences. The relational turn, therefore, does not endorse relativism as it is typically defined, but it embodies and embraces an ethical pluralism, a relationalism, or a perspectivism that complicates the simple binary logic that defines relativism in opposition to moral absolutism. Second, dehumanization. If moral status is not substantiated by ontological properties, but is the product of external relations with others, doesn't this run the risk, as has been noted by Anne Gerdes, that we might lose something valuable, that our human-to-human relations may be obscured by our human-robot relations? In other words, it is possible that what is to be gained for others, including non-human animals, the things of the environment, and technological artifacts, could in fact work in the opposite direction and deface another human individual who, for one reason or another, would not achieve the same kind of recognition. This is precisely the concern of Kathleen Richardson, who argues that the relational turn is just as likely to be misused to instrumentalize and reify human subjects. And she writes this: "But if the machine can become another, what does that say for how robotic and AI scientists conceptualize relationship? Is relationship instrumental? Is relationship mutual and reciprocal?" What worries Richardson is that this relational ethics, with its focus on social embeddings and externalities, would allow for and justify treating other humans as things and not persons. And a response to this potential hazard is to retreat to a dogmatic reassertion of human exceptionalism. And she writes it this way: "Humans are never tools or instruments, even if relations between people take on a formal character. In every encounter, we meet each other as persons, members of a common humanity. Now, a different way to respond to this challenge is to recognize, as the theologian Anne First suggests, that otherness is not in actual practice at least, something that is unlimited or absolute. And she explains it this way. Each of us only assigns personhood to a very few people. The ethical stance is always that we have to assign personhood to everyone, but in reality we don't. We don't care about 1 million people dying in China of an earthquake ultimately in an emotional way. We try to, but we really can't, because we don't share the same physical space. It might be much more important for us if our dog is sick. Now, this statement is perhaps more honest about the way that moral decision-making and the occurrence of otherness actually transpires. Instead of deciding an absolutist claim to a kind of dogmatic totality, it remains open to particular configurations of otherness that is mobile, flexible, and context-dependent. But there remains something in this formulation that for many of us is seemingly abrasive to our moral intuitions. And this may be due to the fact that this way of thinking does not make a singular and absolute decision about otherness that stands once and for all, such that there is one determination concerning others that decides everything for all times. The encounter with others, the occurrence of the face in the face of the other, as Levinas would say, is something that happens in time, and therefore needs to be negotiated and renegotiated again and again. This means then that the work of ethics is ostensibly inexhaustible. It is an ongoing and interminable responsibility, requiring that one respond and take responsibility for how one decides to respond. Now, is this way of thinking and doing ethics without risk? Not at all. But the risk itself is the site of ethics, and it's the challenge that one must face in all interactions with others, whether another human person, a non-human animal, things in the environment, or even an artifact. So thinking otherwise, then, is not dehumanizing, but it's designed to disrupt and decenter a particular form of anthropocentric privilege that has been characteristic of many of our philosophical traditions. All right, just to wrap this up then. Ultimately, the question concerning the moral status of others and other forms of otherness like AI and robots is not really about the artifact. It is about us. It is about the limits of who is included in and what comes to be excluded from that first-person personal pronoun we. It is about how we decide, together and across differences, to respond to and take responsibility for our shared social reality. It is then in responding to the moral opportunities and the challenges posed by seemingly intelligent and social artifacts that we are called to take responsibility for ourselves, for our world, and for those many others who we encounter here. In devising responses to these challenges, we can obviously deploy the standard properties approach. This method has the weight of history behind it, and it therefore constitutes what could be called default setting for addressing questions concerning moral, legal, and social status. But this approach, for all its advantages, also has demonstrated difficulties with determination, definition, and detection of the qualifying property. This doesn't mean, however, and I should point out right now, that the properties approach is somehow wrong or misguided on this account alone. It just means that this way of thinking, despite its almost unquestioned acceptance within 2,000 years of Western traditions, has limitations, and that these limitations are becoming increasingly evident in the face or in the faceplate of AI, robots, and other forms of artifacts, in the face of others who are and remain otherwise. As an alternative, the relational turn formulates an approach to addressing the question of moral and legal status that is situated and oriented otherwise. This alternative circumvents many of the problems encountered in the properties approach by arranging for an ethics that is relational, phenomenological, and diverse. Whether this alternative ultimately provides a better way to formulate moral decision-making is something that will need to be determined and decided in the face of others and other forms of otherness. Ultimately then, the task before us is to learn to question our own sense of exceptionalism. We human beings who have been bestowed with or granted to ourselves the power to decide all things, need to take responsibility for our privilege, for the damage and harms that is perpetrated across the centuries, and for the myriad of exclusions and marginalizations it is instituted and justified. Questioning privilege from the position of privilege is never an easy undertaking. Now I cough, right? This is terrible. But doing so is necessary, especially if we want a moral and legal framework that is responsive to and responsible for others. So, that is what I have by way of prepared remarks. The important thing, I think, are two items here. One is the book is available as a free download. So go ahead and have at it. If this strikes you as interesting, there's a QR code, or you can go to the MIT Press website and just download your own PDF copy. The only disadvantage of giving you a PDF copy, I have nothing to sign for you. So I'm sorry about that. Physical books are better for that part, but this is a better way to distribute things. And I can travel around without carrying books with me, which is also very nice. Secondly, we have time for Q&A right now, obviously. But if you're like me, the really good question is going to happen tomorrow when you're out walking around, or you're, I don't know, on the subway, or you don't have a subway, on the tram. But, you know, when you're riding public transportation, you're sitting there just like, you know, daydreaming, and it's like, damn, I should have asked that question. I would look so smart. If that happens to you, my contact information is there. I invite you to reach out, because in my mind, this only works as a dialogue. And if that dialogue is now, wonderful. If it's a week, a month from now, that's also fine. So, thank you. Yeah, so this is a really good question. And so this is one of these things that people will say, well, yeah, this is all really interesting, but we don't have to worry about it right now. Like, wait until we have robot consciousness, then come and talk to me, right? I'll just wait and see what happens. I think waiting and seeing historically has not turned out so well. We used to think that animals weren't conscious. And so we basically used them as raw material. And then somewhere in the 1970s, Peter Singer wrote Animal Liberation, and we said, oh, wait, animals, they might have emotions. They might feel things. And therefore, our relationship to animals and our moral duty to animals shifted. So the big question with the consciousness question for robots is, when will we know when consciousness is achieved? What's the benchmark? Like, what's the line in the sand that has to be crossed before we will begin to think about these things? So I think, given what we've learned from our previous interactions with other things, not just animals, but the environment, other ways in which we have exploited others, whatever those others may be, leads us to believe that this is a question that we should begin responding to now, before we reach consciousness, because that's more properties approach ways of thinking. And that has in the past yielded some pretty poor outcomes. And so that we may need to prepare for a situation in which we have to take seriously the role of social robots, the role of generative AI in our world, that recognizes that maybe they're not persons, but they're also not fully things, and there's somehow neither one nor the other, and we don't have categories for that yet. And my real push in this book isn't to say that robots should be persons. I don't think robots should be persons, but I also think thing is way too limiting. And the real problem isn't the technology. The real problem is our categories, our legal categories. We only have two, person or thing. So we try to fit these things in this binary opposition, and it doesn't quite work. And this is, I think, for us, a real challenge. Yeah, no, this is really important because, in the sort of Western European traditions, consciousness is a property of an individual. Like the touchstone here is Descartes, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. It's all I. It's very individualistic. Other cultures don't approach the question of consciousness in this way. African traditions don't. Ubuntu provides for a different way of thinking consciousness that's distributed across a community, and that the I emerges from its embeddedness in its community. And so I think if we look at consciousness not as a singular property of an individual, but a result of the fact that we already are alongside and with others, and that consciousness is more of a social phenomenon, social consciousness, then you get a very different understanding of consciousness that I think maps more directly onto this kind of relational way of thinking. So it's a different different sets of traditions give us different ways of resolving these questions. Unfortunately, right now, in the field of AI, consciousness is still very much an individualistic item. People like David Chalmers will talk about when is the AI going to gain consciousness, and he means a singular AI with a singular consciousness. It may be an emergent phenomenon from a community or something like that. It gives you a different way to think about it. Yeah, no, this is also really good. Thank you. So it depends what person we're talking about. So let me just break this down a little bit. The word person comes from the Latin persona. And persona doesn't mean what you and I are. Persona means the mask worn by an actor in Greek and Roman theater. And therefore it's a role. It's role playing. It's the role you play that makes you a person. As a result, we have two different senses of person. We have natural persons, which is what we think we are. We're born persons. Although, again, in other traditions, you become a person over time. In Ubuntu, you're not born a person. Your community bestows personhood on you as you evolve and become a mature human being. But for most European traditions, personhood is granted at birth, and it's natural personhood. But we also have legal personhood. And right now, in this room, in this world that we occupy, at this moment in time, there are artifacts that are full persons like you and I in terms of their legal status. Do you know what we call those persons? Corporations. Corporations are persons. And why are they persons? Not because they're conscious, not because they're sentient, not because their feelings can be hurt, but because we need them to be subjects of our legal system. Basically, and we want to hold them responsible for wrongdoing. And in order to do that, they have to be persons. So the question becomes, if AI starts to occupy a position like the corporation, wouldn't it make sense to extend to it the same status as legal person that we give to the corporation? Now, the EU tried this back in 2017. They created a new status called electronic person. And they did it mainly for liability purposes, for suing the AI, and also for taxation, because they wanted to have a way of taxing companies who brought automation into their factories and displaced human workers to be able to pay into the social safety net. It sounded like a really good idea, legally speaking. The AI community hated it. They said, this is the worst idea in the world, don't do it. And so they didn't do it. But you can bet this is not the first or last time somebody's going to try this. And so it all depends on what person we're talking about as we resolve that question. If we're talking natural person, yeah, the bar for natural person is extremely high. Even animals will never be natural persons in the way that you and I are, at least as we understand it. But they can be legal persons. Mountains are legal persons. Rivers are legal persons. So it wouldn't be much of a stretch to extend legal personhood to an artifact. Yeah, this is good. So it's not just ChatGPT, but we've discovered these things that talk to us, like Alexa or Siri. When you bring them into the home, because it's your domestic setting, and Alexa does something for you, people are thanking Alexa. They're saying, thank you, Alexa. And we don't say thank you to the hammer when we build a house. We don't say thank you to our calculator. We don't thank our car when we get out of it for getting us to work, right? We don't thank things. We thank persons. And it's not because Alexa is more intelligent than your car. She's probably less intelligent than your car. But nevertheless, because it has language, it plays a social role. And it's that social presence that really makes the difference. And being polite to other things that are linguistically enabled and able to engage us in language is just something that makes us social. It's part of what the glue that holds us together as a society. So saying please and thank you to ChatGPT or Alexa has become a kind of habit. But it's not because of what they are, the algorithm. It's because of what we are and the way that we respond to social presence. And yes, I say thank you to things. No, so it's a really important question. And there is, and this won't surprise you, there's an entire area of research now, which is not my area of research, but other people like Sven Nyholm and other individuals who are researching love and sex with robots. And there's a whole research field of sex robots. If you've not heard of it, it's there, and it's pretty robust these days. But it turns out, yes, we do love things. We do, you talk to a musician and they have a special relationship with their instrument. You talk to soldiers who have special relationships to their weapon because it is really saving their lives. And so the research into sex robots is looking at how we can have these sort of one-way emotional contact with things that can't reciprocate, but nevertheless for us is very satisfying. And trying to figure out what that all means for human relationships, as you can imagine, is very complex and has all kinds of consequences. But just recently, there was a Japanese man who married in a legal ceremony a chatbot. And the chatbot was his legally wedded wife. Here's the really sad and tragic part of the story. The company that made and supported the software for the chatbot went out of business. And so now his wife can't be updated. And so he's stuck with his wife in whatever form she is right now. There's another individual by the name of Dave Cat. Dave Cat lives in Michigan, just over the lake from where I am in Chicago. And Dave Cat has been living with a robot for over 10 years that he refers to as his companion robot. And for him, it's just that's family life, him and his robot. So, these are right now, like, it's sort of aberrations, right? But you can see the way in which this field is developing and people are very interested because it gets to the core of what we think makes us human, the ability to love. Yeah, so I encourage you to look at the research if you want. Right. So this gets into the difference between, a physically embodied robot and a cloud-based AI. And early on, one of the first chatbots, in fact, the first chatbot, a piece of script written by Joseph Weizenbaum called Liza, allowed people to chat with a very early chatbot in the 1960s. And people formed very close relationships with that bot, even though it didn't have a body. And again, it's because of language. And the linguistic component, because we define ourselves as zoon, logon, echon. That's what the Greeks said about us. We're the animal with language, right? The other things that don't have language. And so for years, we could say, okay, we can kill all the animals and turn them into leather for shoes and food and stuff because they don't have language. They're not like us. They're less important. And we can do the same with our artifacts, etc. Over the 20th century, we learned that animals actually do have a kind of language. Whales, dolphins, even crows. And that sort of eroded our exceptionalism with regards to language and our relationship to the animal. The same thing is happening with ChatGPT and these other applications because they have language in ways that absolutely make us question whether or not they're conscious or not when we're interacting with them. And as a result, like in the film Her, people sort of, have that veil that they place in front of them their interaction where they don't care what's there. They have a close connection because of the way the language is utilized. So I think social presence matters for the physically embodied robot, and that's important. But I think also language is really important. And you see the language component much more in the cloud-based stuff. Yeah, good, thanks. So to the first one. Yeah, I think one of the things that really is abrasive to challenging the sort of standard ways of thinking about moral decision-making is the fact that we want ethics to be this sort of like a universalist thing, that all human beings have the same ethics, and it's just a matter of adhering to these standards. Kant was this way, right? The categorical imperative is, the imperative works for all people in all circumstances, and therefore it is stable across time, space, etc. Turns out that when we start to think outside the sort of European framework, ethics is no longer stable. Confucianism has a different set of ethics. Shintoism has a different set of ethics. So different cultures, different traditions have different ways of thinking about ethics. And as we start to look at the alignment problem in AI, we say we want to align AI to human values. Well, the question is, whose human values? Are we aligning AI to a Western European set of values, or are we aligning AI to a Chinese set of values? You can bet those are going to be very different in terms of the alignment. And it comes down, unfortunately, to power. This is Nietzsche's point. Behind ethics is power. Someone gets to decide what is good and what is evil. And it's not something God-given, even though we want it to be. And as a result, every universal that we promote tends to be a particular that's raised to the status of a universal through some exertion of power or some political force. And the other way to think about this is to realize that maybe law understands this better than ethics does. Like in law, we have different legal jurisdictions. Like one law in one place can be very different from the law in another place. I'll give you a really good example with AI. There's a guy named Ryan Abbott, and he's going around the world with a invention that was created by Dabus in AI. It's a little food storage system. It's like Tupperware, right? And he's trying to get a patent for the AI in different places. He tried in the US and failed. He tried in the UK and he failed. And the reason he failed in the UK and the US is because in the way the law is written in the US and the UK, it says only natural persons can be inventors. So the AI can't be an inventor. But he was successful in South Africa and Australia, because in South Africa and Australia, you don't need to be a natural person. So right now, AI is and is not an inventor based on different jurisdictions of how the law is written. And we get along in legal practice pretty well with differing legal standards. And we can do this sort of pluralism thing that Charles S. is talking about, this idea there could be some shared points of contact, but there could be very distinct differences based on context. And I think ethics has to get a little more comfortable with difference. I think we've been a little too, we've been wanting totality. And I think being a little more attentive to differentiation in values, that the axiological differences across space, across time, can, be something that is like biodiversity. It might actually be of something that is important, different ways of responding to these challenges. But it does seem abrasive to sort of a Western way of thinking, because for 2,000 years, we thought it's got to be stable. It's got to be one way of doing things. I'm sorry, and then the speed of change. That's the other thing I forgot. No, it's very quick. So, our technology advances at light speed. Our law and ethics advances at pen and paper speed. And we're always trying to catch up. And therefore, we're always behind. And as a result, the sooner we can begin thinking about these problems and these challenges, the better. But we're always playing catch up. Right, okay, so good. Do you have children?
No.
Okay. We also create children. Right? We produce children. Children aren't things, although for the Romans they were. For the pater familias, the head of the family in Roman law, he could sell his children into slavery because they were things. They were property. Now, we've gotten better about the position of children, although there's still problems. I mean, if you look at the UN Convention on Children, it's not perfect, but it's better than what the Romans had. So the main point here is that this person-thing dichotomy, this wasn't given to us by God. This comes from Gaius. Who's Gaius, you say? Gaius is a Roman jurist in the 2nd century AD who said that the law is concerned with two things, persons or things. So he gave us this binary distinction. And for 2,000 years, we've been taking things and fitting them in one category or the other. Corporations come along in the 19th century and we're like, okay, what are these? Are they things or are they persons? And we said, oh, they're persons, because we want to be able to sue them. So we put them in that box. Other things come along, like animals. And for the longest time, animals were considered raw material. They were considered things. 100 years ago, my grandfather, who owned dogs to hunt, was considered a dog owner, and his dogs were considered a tool to help him do his job of hunting. And when one of those tools didn't work, what did Grandpa do? Took it out back and shot it. Because that's what you do with a broken tool. You dispose of it. Today, this sounds barbaric. 100 years later, I am no longer a pet owner or a dog owner. I am now a pet parent. I don't buy a dog as a piece of property. I adopt a dog, and when I adopt a dog, the adoption agency comes to my house to see if my house is safe enough for the dog that I'm adopting, right? Now, what's changed? The dog's DNA is about the same, right? There's no change in the dog as a creature. What's changed is us, our relationship to the animal. So what we're doing right now in the 21st century is we are struggling against 2,000-year-old binary oppositions that don't fit our reality. Dogs aren't full persons, but they're also not things. So what the hell are they? Robots, also not persons, but also maybe not fully things. And so we're trying to fit a Roman law invention to address the challenges that we face right now as we look at our animals, look at our robots, we look at all kinds of other things like artificial life, right? These things that scientists are now building in laboratories that are biological, but they're fully artificial. You can also see in other areas of recent debate, the abortion debate is really about what status the fetus has. Is the fetus a thing or a person? And if it's not a thing, when does it become a person? When's that line crossed? And different places have decided 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks. It's very arbitrary. And it's because we're trying to use these categories to make sense of a reality that doesn't fit this binary distinction. And so what the book is about is really, we need new categories. We don't need to level the playing field. We need to rewrite the rules because the rules are no longer working for us. Yeah, so this is a good question. So let me answer this question about rights. What is really interesting right now is that at this point in time, we already have robots that have rights. And you're thinking, oh my God, how's that possible? I'm not talking about human rights, first of all, right? Human rights are a very specific set of rights that belong to one particular entity, the human being. But we're talking about rights in the very essential way that they're described by Wesley Hohlfeld. They're either powers, privileges, claims, or immunities. It's ways that we grant something a certain social status to deal with conflict. So you don't have them here, but in the US on college campuses, we have these little delivery robots that drive around and deliver food to students. So the students are studying in the library, they order something on their app, the robot drives up to the front of the library, they walk outside, open the robot, grab the coffee, and go back inside. It's kind of cute. They're called personal delivery devices. And the company that builds these things realized at one point that when these are operating on the street, there's a potential conflict between two different actors on the street, and that is an automobile and the robot. So what happens when the robot is in a crosswalk and the car slams into the robot? And so they lobbied 12 states in the US to make laws protecting the robot on the street. And so in 12 states in the US, robots on the street, in the crosswalk, have the rights and responsibilities of a pedestrian. Now, this doesn't mean that the law is recognizing the robot as a pedestrian. It doesn't mean that we're recognizing the robot as a person. It's just saying we have pedestrian rules to govern who has the right of way in a crosswalk, and how can we apply those to robots? We just give robots the same rights as pedestrians. So what is occurring right now at this point in time is, even if we don't resolve the person-thing dichotomy, we're still going to have to make rules. We're still going to have to make decisions about who has the right of way, who has a responsibility, who has rights, who has duties, etc. And we're doing this by very slowly making decisions about how to apply existing laws to new objects. And as a result, we have robots with rights. And this is not the first time or the only way this is going to transpire. Yeah, so this is good. I like this question because we think that the problem is the technology. Like, we got a problem with AI, we got a problem with robots. But I think the real problem is with our way of making sense of these things. Our frameworks, our categories, our mental constructs that you say, we will apply, but we maybe need to rethink these things. One thing about technology that I think is borne out in the history of the philosophy of technology is that no matter what technology you're talking about, it serves as a mirror. And it reflects back to us certain expectations and understandings of ourselves. And that in the process of looking in the mirror of the most recent innovations in technology, like AI and robots, we're starting to see things about us that make us question certain expectations of our own, certain ideas about human exceptionalism, certain ideas about what makes us special compared to all these other things in the world. I think a really good example are the generative AIs, like the large language models, DALL-E, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion. We have been consistently over time sort of drawing a line in the sand and saying, okay, this is where we're different and the AIs are over there. So in the 50s, we said AIs will never play chess. We drew a line in the sand. And then in 1996, Deep Blue beat Gary Kasparov at chess. And we said, oops, okay, that's not the line. Okay, AIs will never play Go, much more complicated. Go is so complicated, there's more moves in a game of Go than there are atoms in the universe, right? That's a lot of moves. And so we thought, impossible for AI. And then Lee Sedol got beaten by DeepMind's AlphaGo. And then we said, okay, they'll never use language. And then we got large language models. And then we said, okay, they'll never be creative. And then we got DALL-E and Midjourney. And it's like we keep getting backed into the corner by these kinds of decisions. And these are ways in which I think these technologies allow us to really do some deep dive thinking about ourselves and about what we think makes us special. Because we are special, but what is it that makes us special? I think that's the important question. Yeah, really good. Thank you for both questions. I think the way this comes off, and unfortunately it's a product of it being short and needing to be packaged in this way, is it comes off as the one property approach versus the relational approach. I don't think it's a matter of an opposition. I think the relational approach helps provide a better foundation for the properties approach. The whole properties way of thinking is really a heuristic. After we have loads of encounters with certain sorts of different others, we eventually create a heuristic and say, well, they're like me. They have consciousness. Even if we can't define it, we have this heuristic that allows us to make a shortcut and not have to process the cognitive load that is brought by any encounter with a new kind of other. And so I think the one fits very nicely with the other. It's just a matter of the procedure, which one provides the foundation, as opposed to, I think the way we normally thought about it was the properties were the foundation. I think it's the other way around. I think the relation is the foundation, and the properties are kind of the heuristic that is utilized as we move forward. To the other question about power. Yeah, I think as long as you're looking at properties, you can hide the power, because then it seems scientific, it seems objective. As soon as you move away from the properties approach to things, then it becomes very much about who gets to decide for that particular encounter. And therefore, you're in a situation that is much more, I think, democratic, more deliberative, but also more fraught, more complicated. And there will be differences. But I think those differences are crucial, because it's in the differences that you see the power. Otherwise, it's hidden. And I think then you don't know what the influence is on these decisions. Yeah, thanks. That's really good. So first to this idea of like a critique of the instrumentalist way of thinking. I should just point out that in 1954, Martin Heidegger came to Bremen and gave a talk that was critical of the instrumentalist way of thinking. So there's a long tradition of Bremen being the place where you do this kind of critique, which I think is really, really quite nice. But I think for me, the situated knowledge part of this really comes out of Haraway. And I think Haraway's work provides us for a way of thinking about the manner by which a lot of these values and a lot of the ways the values and the axiology is utilized is always context specific. And we tend to miss that. And as we're all going back to the question of power, somebody always has the ability to build the framework that is utilized for asking these questions in the first place, but also developing the responses to them. And so being really careful about understanding the situational context by which a lot of these questions are even asked to begin with, I think goes a long way to beginning to sort of build this critique in a much more practical and more concrete way. So it's not just some sort of abstraction, but it allows us to see ways in which even seemingly neutral descriptions of technology can be extremely biased in one way or another, or influenced in one way or another. And I think the the goal for us is to learn how to use what the feminists have been doing in science and technology studies for a couple decades here. Understand the subjectivity of science and of technology, for that matter. Both really good questions. Let me start with Mutaleb's first question. Isn't this another kind of centrism? And it would be if relations were static. Relations are always different. They change. And so, not in this book, but in a previous book, I argued that this way of thinking would be an eccentric moral theory, that it would have many centers, and that those centers would shift based on context. As a result, it is a antidote to the sort of sequence of centrisms that have evolved over time. We had human-centric moral theories, we had animal-centric moral theories, we had biocentric moral theories. Luciano Floridi gave us an infocentric moral theory. There's always a center, but when there's a center, there's a periphery. And an eccentric moral theory recognizes that we are often violating those edges and creating new centers outside of that limited way of thinking. So I think what I like about Levinas is that he doesn't have a centrism. He's eccentric in the very literal sense, that there's a plurality of centers. And those centers shift, they change based on who the other is and what the other does, which gets to the second question. So I take my cue from Levinas here, and this goes back to your question about phenomenology. Before you know anything about the other, there is the experience of otherness. So in Levinas, alterity or other is not a noun, it's a verb. There's an action of othering. There's an action of experiencing something that's not I, that's not me. And even before you know what it is or what it can do to you, there's that experience of alienation, of the other as other. And so I think that is the more fundamental phenomenological foundation here. That, in fact, what we know of the other happens in the response we make, and then what it does in response to that. But that's already downstream. I think if we try to recognize the other as an alter ego, as Buber does, I think that already domesticates the other. It already makes the other one of us. And therefore, it violates the alterity that it presents. And so I think the Levinasian way, and Levinasian phenomenology, is such that even before you can know anything at all about the other, there is the experience of the impinging of otherness upon you that calls for a response. And it's only in the response that these other questions are asked and able to be responded to. I hope that answers it. Right, and I would say that's kind of what I've argued, that the initial response that we make already starts that chain of events. But there's something that happens before that initial response. And the something that is before that initial response is the experience of otherness, of the face of the other, as Levinas would say. I don't know if you know Levinas, Jewish philosopher, pretty influential in the 20th century. But when Levinas wrote, the other was already only human. Levinas was still very anthropocentric. And then the people I studied with in the 90s were trying to make Levinas open up and recognize the animal as an other. So there were people like Matthew Calarco and John Llewellyn who were all trying to say, well, Levinas can't exclude animals because animals also perform this action. They also are experienced as other. And so you had this whole attempt to build out the animal side of the other. Derrida was very influential in this. And then you had people doing it with the environment. So environmental ethicists said, okay, if animals can be other, why not trees? And they took it one step further. So it's always, once you have an other, then it becomes a question of the other, and the other of the other of the other, and it just cascades. And so if I have any contribution to this lineage, it's that I just said, well, why not robots? Why not artifacts? Why is that to be the last excluded other? And it's just a matter of recognizing that if we're really consistent in what Levinas gives us, we have to really challenge Levinas on his own terms, because he was maybe not as consistent as he should have been. Yeah. Let me start backwards, work with the second one. Who's going to make this change? I'm sorry to say that I think this change is going to be made behind closed doors by legislators and judges. It's a decision that will be made for us. Right now, the AI Act is being decided for you. And who is talking to the European Parliament and everybody else involved there? It's the big tech giants like Google and Amazon. And so this sort of stuff is going to be decided by the powerful and the elites. And that is a problem for our democracy, because if we want to have a voice in this, we need a seat at the table. And in many cases, we don't have a seat at the table. Even worse, in common law traditions, like in the US, it's judges that will decide this. Like this idea of robots having the rights of pedestrians, that was decided by a judge who wanted to figure out a problem. And then it was codified in law. But, a singular judge can have a whole lot of power in common law traditions that can really influence the direction of these decisions. So if anything, this just says that we've got to really reassert our democratic right at this period of time, because if we're not, these decisions will be made without our input. And that, I think, is unacceptable for me and probably for everybody else. The other one, is there a solution in the book? I believe there's a solution in the book. I try to give a solution in the book. But the problem is that all the solutions are really complicated. So whenever we have a binary, right, you've got the left, the right, you want the center, right? Or you got person, thing, just give me that thing that's in the middle, the third category. Okay, even though the Romans said you're a person or a thing, the Romans had a third category in between person and thing. Can you guess what the third thing in between person and thing was? Slaves. Yep. And there are some really brilliant legal scholars who've had this really brilliant idea. And they've said, all we've got to do is reactualize Roman slave law and apply it to robots. Solution. Now, I worry about this for a couple of reasons. Number one, the people presenting this solution are mainly white dudes speaking from the position of the master. And because they occupy the position of mastery, it seems like no problem to them. They forget that there are people on the other end of slavery who didn't have that privilege and that had a very complicated history with slavery. So I'm not worried about what the robots are going to feel about being enslaved. I don't care, actually, because they don't feel anything. I'm worried about what it says about us. Are we willing to treat and create a society of slaves? Do we want to be masters again? And I think there's a lot of political, social, cultural problems with that move. So I try to come up with a solution that doesn't fall into the trap of slavery. And that's the last chapter in the book. Yeah, no, this is a really interesting question. I have to take what they say to us on face value. I can't get inside their head and know what they're thinking, right? I have to only work with what they say. And when you ask Dave Catt, this guy who has the robot in Michigan, how he thinks about the robot, he will correct you and say, it's not a robot. It's my companion. And he is very, like the character in Her, he is very much dedicated to this thing as a romantic partner. And it isn't even a question in his mind that it could be something different. I don't know about the Japanese man because I not had access to what he's said about it. But I do know, I've met Dave Catt, and he's told me these things. And I have to believe him, even though for those of us not in Dave Catt's world, this seems like a strange place to be. But for him, it's very normal. And it's something that makes a lot of sense. To go back to the other question about suing the artifact. Right now, we can sue a corporation, and the corporation can pay out damages, and none of the human beings behind the corporation will feel any of the effect of the legal action. One of the reasons we make corporations persons is to insulate shareholders and corporate CEOs and things from wrongdoing when it's the corporation that is found guilty for something. One of the problems with corporate personhood is that when we punish corporations, it doesn't really feel satisfying, right? When you punish BP for an oil spill and they pay $1 million or $2 million, right? People are like, well, yeah, this doesn't really hurt them. They're a multinational corporation with billions of dollars in assets. It doesn't really satisfy our sense of justice. So if there is a problem with corporate personhood, it's punishment. We don't know how to punish the corporation. We will not know how to punish the AI. I mean, right now, the one suggestion people have made is if it is a large language model or some other sort of generative system, you would have to basically take apart the algorithm and destroy all its data. And that would be the punishment for some wrongdoing. But you can already see in like actual legal cases now, we're trying to figure out who's responsible for a self-driving car hitting a pedestrian, and no one wants to be responsible. And that's also a problem.
I don't see anybody else. Then I would like to put me on the list with a little question, which is more contextualizing. So coming from relational sociology, I can follow any relational argument, so no problem with this. But the question I have is, did you ever think about relate your arguments to relational sociology? Because there already category like person or thing does not exist.
Yeah.
So there's a long tradition for more than 100 years to build up social sciences which are more interested in the construction of exactly such categories and which developed a way of thinking which is empirically driven but beyond.
Yeah.
Even does not understand agency as something which is individual, but as something which always emerges within relations between humans, but also partly between humans and things. So really my question is, I haven't read this book yet, but your others, is this a way of thinking where you would say you can link your arguments with, or is it too much on, how can I put it, the empirical side of it?
Quick answer. Yes.
Okay.
No, long answer. So I'm not an empirical researcher, but I have friends who are social scientists, the Edwards, Marty DeGraff, and a few others. And what I've been really fascinated since I did the early work in the books prior to this, they have actually tested a lot of the stuff in experimental settings and have evolved some solutions that I had not thought of. And that stuff has actually filtered into this book. So even though I don't do it, I really learn a lot from that kind of work, because I think inevitably you want to talk to people and find out, what they are doing, what they are thinking, and what evolves up out of their experiences. Because I think if it's only top down, you're going to miss a lot.
Well, thanks a lot. A great advertisement for the book at the end.